Well, to put the environmental movement in context, you have to understand in the late part of the 1940s, almost 1949, early 50s, is when hydrocarbons were attached to and created to make things like plastics and other things, and thus the birth of the chemical revolution. So by the time at the end of the 60s, it was pretty clear that we had a massive chemical problem around the country. And at the same time, we had all the impact of the Industrial Revolution that was still manifesting itself. So you could touch the air, you could see the air. Smokestacks were just black every place. And there were chemicals leaching out from every pipe, every piece of landfill, and there were basically no regulations and nothing really existed. And this was really at the time that the Vietnam War was going on, and there was a lot of confusion in our nation. And so it was the beginning of really the environmental movement. And at that time, I had the good fortune of applying for a scholarship in the U.S. Public Health Service, and I went out with 18 other people of different disciplines, and our job out there was from 8 to 5 for many months to brainstorm in the LA basin to try to figure out how to deal with the impending Federal Clean Air Act that had yet to pass. And at the end of that session, that period of time, I returned to Connecticut, took a job in the Air Pollution Control Agency at the local level, and there was no state program at that point, and the Clean Air Act was just about to pass, and it did pass. And I was continuing in the U.S. Public Health Service, and I went to Yale and NYU, and at that time, the father of Earth Day, co-founder of Earth Day, was Dan Lufkin, and he had really been on the cover of Fortune magazine, and he was really recognized as a significant guy who became the first commissioner in the state of Connecticut. And so I was extremely young, but I went to the hearing, and at that hearing, nobody really knew how to implement the law, but I went, and I thought my testimony would be over in about 10 minutes. About 2.5 hours later, it was over. And that evening, I got a call, and I was asked to go see Commissioner Lufkin the next day, which I did do. And he didn't really care how old you were. He really cared, could you do it? And so I went in and I said, Commissioner Lufkin, you want to see me? Why do you want to see me? And he said, can you do the things that you said yesterday? And I said, being a young man, I can do anything you want. And he said, good. I want you to be my air director. And I want to be the first in the nation to have the state be the first in the nation to have the first state implementation plan. With Dan Lufkin, everything had to be first. Everything had to be the best. And we were the first in the nation. And really, it was a time to educate people, even the federal government, on what they had to do to meet state regulations. It was the only law at the time, and since then, that really delegated to states how they needed to go about implementing federal law. A little bit after that, the Clean Water Act passed, and the federal government had trouble getting the regulations out. So they, in the Ford administration at this point, asked me to come down and take over the water program. Now, my strength really was in the air program, but they asked me to go and now take this new law and try to get the federal standards out for the Clean Water Act, which I did. And in doing that, I also began to understand that the law really needed to be directed at toxics. Every Monday morning, Russell Train and John Quarles, who had taken over as the second administrator of EPA because Bill Ruckelshaus was the first, he didn't stay there very long. They had taken over, and I was in a meeting with all the DAAs because I was a deputy assistant administrator, highest ranking, and they were talking about the toxic problem, which they didn't know was toxic, but at that time, under PCB ketone. And so I raised my hand and I said, I think this agency needs a toxic strategy. At which point, John Quarles and Russell Train looked at each other and they looked at me and they said, yes, we do. You're chairman of it. All these DAAs report to you. I knew at that point that I'd been given a task that I had no idea how I was going to get implemented. So I was now chair of the Toxic Committee. And the only way I could get it implemented was divide that group of DAAs into 4 different groups, which I did. And each of those groups really developed the National Toxic Strategy. And I did that in conjunction with national environmental groups. And the President of the United States then, at the time, was Gerald Ford, but Jimmy Carter had won the election. And so Jimmy Carter gave me the national award for developing the National Toxic Strategy. At this point, Doug Costel, who now is the commissioner, and we were co-commissioners in Connecticut, came in to EPA, and he asked me if I'd help go get the new RAs to help delegate the Clean Water Act. So I agreed to take a temporary assignment to help coordinate the state RAs to delegate the Clean Water Act. During that period of time, the Resource Conservation Recovery Act couldn't get out of Washington. Well, Doug Costel, Commissioner Costel, who's now Administrator Costel, said I had to get back to Washington. He needed me to take over that program. So I took it over, and I then was able to get out the Resource Conservation Recovery Act legislation. Now, it was at that time that I then was asked to go up and christen a boat in the Niagara Falls area. And when I went up there, my press secretary said, we've heard something about Love Canal, and we'd like you to go over and see it. Now, when I went over and I saw it, I knew we were working on a piece of law that hadn't yet hit the Congress, but we needed to have a poster child so we could have it as a feature to advance that law. So I saw what I thought was actually the poster child. And I called Doug and I said, Doug, I think I've seen the poster child and I have to do a press conference for the boat, but I'd like to focus on Love Canal if you don't mind. He said, go for it. And so I did. And I said, we're going to christen the boat today, but I've seen a ticking time bomb. Well, it had the effect that we wanted. And I got on a plane, and the first stop I had to make was in LaGuardia Airport. When I arrived at LaGuardia Airport, it hit the EP wire. Walter Cronkite at that point had his crew waiting for me. And they told me before they asked me the question, they said, we're going to tell you what the answer is. I said, this never has happened to me before. So I said, okay, what's the answer? They said, a ticking time bomb. They asked me the question. I gave them the answer. Well, it hit the national news that night, and it became really the beginning of the foundation for Superfund, CERCLA, as it's officially known. Well, the next morning I get a call from Doug Costa, who says to me, the President of the United States wants you to come down because Hugh Carey, who's the governor, wants to come down and meet with his chief of staff, Stu Eisenstadt, and another person, Jack Watson, and he wants you in the room with them. So I went into the room with them, and Stu Eisenstadt, his chief of staff, said, listen, Governor Carey has asked these people to come down. Chris, we want you here not necessarily to say much, but we'll handle it. And so in the room, Governor Carey's request to his people was that he wanted taxpayer money, federal emergency management money, to go to deal with Love Canal, at which point I didn't agree with it. And so I said, I don't think this is a very good idea. And when I said it, I knew that I was basically being insubordinate, but I felt that whatever the costs were, let it be. So after I left the room, we all left the room, I could see that Hugh Carey's group went out and were in front of cameras, and they were telling everybody it was a very successful meeting, that they believed that the chief of staff had committed to the government to use federal emergency money. When I got into my car, we had phones at that point, and I got a call from Doug Costello, and he said, turn around, the president wants to see you in his office. So I turned my car around and went back to see the President of the United States, President Jimmy Carter. And so I went in to see the president, and he said to me, sit down, I want to hear your side of the story. And I sat there for 1 hour, and I explained to him why I thought it was a bad idea, why I felt there were so many sites like this around the country, that I felt the taxpayer money would be not well spent to deal with them. And I felt the foundation of what this nation needed was the foundation of that law called CERCLA, or Superfund. He listened to me intently, thoughtfully, and at the end of the meeting, he said, I think it's an excellent law. I want you to go back. I want you to get that piece of legislation to me, and you should do your job. A big part of the ongoing effort was to take it out of basically having the recognition that the president being aware of this and making sure that the Congress of the United States of America was aware of it. So a big part of my job over the next really year as that legislation was moving forward is that I'd go around the country and take congressmen and senators to different sites. And so, for instance, I remember going with Senator Hines and Congressman Florio, and I went to a site in Pittsburgh, which is where trucks would come in and they'd stop at a diner and they'd empty their chemicals at a pit behind the diner, and it would go down maybe 100 feet and come out below and go into a river. That site was Pittston. And then I'd go down to Houston, where Ray Roberts was congressman at that time, and I'd take him to the Houston Ship Channel, and I'd show him all the sites that were in his district. And Senator Biz Johnson, who was chairman of the Public Works Committee, I'd take him to some of his sites in West Virginia. And then I'd fly to California, and I'd take some of the congressmen and senators to sites in their district. And really, the effect of all that was to take the awareness of the problem away from just the Washington media and take the awareness of the problem to the districts and the places where they had constituency. Because if you take the awareness, Democrats or Republicans, to where they have constituency, their constituents are, then you're making it real. And often that's a terribly important thing to do, because public policy is created out of public demand. And during that period of time in the 70s, the environmental movement was so powerful that I didn't really know the difference between a Republican and a Democrat. That was never, ever something that ever really entered into my discussions. When I went up to the Hill, it always became an issue that was more about how you're going to go about it, what you're going to do, and how should we be balancing the issues around it. Because those, at the end of the day, were where the nation was at this time. Looked at where we are, you would see that it's so much changed. The culture has changed tremendously. And as a result of that, you now have industries that have emerged that are all about pricing out externalities. And thus what has emerged is the insurance industry, for instance. And you can buy insurance for things. So you can, in the risk management of these things, the insurance industry has really emerged over the last decades as being a way that you're able to price a risk into your investment decisions. And so I see what has evolved literally since 1980 as really a total evolution that now has priced in to discussion that every CEO and CFO knows, particularly in their property and casualty insurance, that if you think you have a pollution problem, it's excluded. Now, that exclusion literally, I think, came the day that Dan Lufkin and I went to see Hank Greenberg to ask if he wanted to invest in the company that we had founded, Environmental Testing and Certification. And Dan said to me as we were going up the elevator in early 1980, you're not going to have more than 5 minutes with Hank Greenberg. He's the quickest study in the world. 2.5 hours later, the meeting was over. I said, Dan, this guy's going to invest. That's not what happened that day. That day, he came up with the pollution exclusion. That's true. Well, in 1980, Jimmy Carter obviously got defeated. Ronald Reagan came in. Actually, Dan Lufkin was a Republican at the time. He flew down to see me, actually, in Washington. And he asked me whether I wanted to stay on as administrator, because one of the 3 areas that he had been asked to search for people was the Environmental Protection Agency. And I said to him, it was an interesting story. I said to him, Dan, look, I've effectively been running this agency for a long time now. And, I have a daughter and a son who are very young. And it's time that I go out and try to find a way to make some real money. And so he said to me, and I'll never forget this, it was a French restaurant that I didn't really have the ability to even think I could pick up the check, but I had to that night. But so I went through the business idea with him. And so he said, I think that's an excellent business idea. I'll be your partner. And I was taken back by it. And he said, I'll bankroll you. I want 50% of the plan. You got 3 months to get it done. And 3 months later, I had a business plan. 5 years later, the environmental testing and certification company had gone public, and we sold it for $500 million. Now, Dan had most of his half. I had very little because I had to bring in all the people that helped me get it done. But it was a fantastic, fantastic company because it was based on taking chemistry and data and creating management information that would, in essence, create the tools that would help management understand the risk that they were having as it related to compliance with their permits. So I always felt that that was the beginning of loss control. During the 70s, what we were doing is that we knew that chemicals needed to be permitted, and thus they needed to be regulated, and they needed to be reported on. And so we had a very good understanding of the market that we were creating and how the analytic industry needed to develop and what that meant in terms of how it needed to be turned into reports. And so, in essence, what we were developing was really all the market research that anybody that could see what we were doing would know what we were doing. And it was that really, in my mind, became a really good study for a business plan. And if anybody understands anything about the chemicals and what they need to do, a big part of the information that you need is stuff that comes off of a mass spec. And that's a mass spectroscopy. And that can identify up to 60,000 chemicals. But there were two people that had manufactured mass specs. One was Hewlett-Packard, the other was Finnegan. But Hewlett-Packard not only had mass specs, but they had computers at that time. So Lou Platt was, at that time, head of research for Hewlett-Packard, who subsequently became president. But I approached Lou Platt, and I said, Lou, I want to buy your mass specs, but I want your mainframe computers to talk to my mass specs because I want the information to pass over to the mainframes, because what I'm interested in doing is really creating reports. Because I'm not interested in selling samples, although I know that we're selling, but I'm interested in selling reports. And in essence, what I did was I created a whole new industry that really got rid of engineers, if you will. Because engineers can read reports. They don't need to sell millions of hours to get analytical data into a report. And if you really think about that and translate that into the insurance industry, for instance, the insurance industry really is spending so much time creating paperwork that it can just find other ways to do that and free up so much time to do other things.